I'm Sandie Gittel. Today is February 14th, 1974. I'm going to interview George LePard. The general topic will be Potlatch, Idaho. Mr. LePard, where were you born?
I was born at Melrose, Idaho, and I was born December the 25th, 1899. My mother only lived about 8 months after I was born, but my father was Dr. J.S. LePard, one of the early day doctors in the state of Idaho. They didn't have to have too much education to be a doctor in those days. My father's education was actually a practical experience that he got working with another doctor in Chicago. But he did graduate from the Omaha Medical College in 1895, and he immediately came to Idaho because of being a new state. He thought there would be a good spot for a doctor. And he came to Idaho right away. And he was up at Murray, Idaho. He didn't stay there very long. He sold a cow to a fellow, and the sale didn't work out very good for either one of them, because the fellow that bought the cow was pretty mad at my dad, and he hit him over the head with a chair and knocked my father's teeth out. My father went to Spokane and had his teeth put in, and the story that he always told us was that he got his teeth knocked out by rolling down a mountainside with our saddle pony. I was working on a fruit ranch down by Wenatchee, and a fellow walked up to me one day and said, by any chance was your dad a doctor in the Coeur d'Alenes around 1900? And I said, yes, he was. And did he ever tell you how he got his teeth knocked out? And I said, yeah, he said our saddle pony rolled down a mountainside with him. Oh, no, that wasn't the way that happened at all. The fellow hit your father's head with a chair, knocked his teeth out. Well, when I went home, my father was bedridden the last 4 years of his life, and he was on a bed in the corner in a big room that we had, and I walked in and I said, how are you feeling anyway? He said, well, I feel pretty good. I've had a real bad heart attack. I said, you remember that story you told me about the saddle pony rolling down the mountainside with you? He said, yes, I do. What happened to the cow? And about that time, his feet come off the bed, and he got well in a hurry. He told me all about that the fellow had told me the truth. And we got quite a kick out of it, because he got away with that story for about 26, 7 years. Well, anyway, as I say, my father was one of the early doctors in Idaho, and he usually followed wherever there was a sawmill being built. We heard that there was going to be a sawmill built at Potlatch, Idaho. So he thought that would be a good place to see if he could resettle, and he came to Potlatch. But the Potlatch people were building their own town, and he couldn't buy anything right in town. So he went over to a little place that was called Onaway, and he bought a small piece of property from a farmer and set up his own drugstore. My father always liked to have cows and chickens and horses, and so he had a place where he could have all of that, and we had a real good barn, and we really had it pretty good in Potlatch. Now, you've asked me about what I did for a living, and I went to school in Potlatch from first grade through high school. I graduated from high school in 1921. I worked in the sawmill a very short time, but I heard that there was an opening in the grocery store, and I thought maybe that I would make a small fortune in the grocery store business if I'd learned something about it. So I worked as a clerk for a while, and then I went to Troy, Idaho, and operated a small chain for a few years. But in 1930, I started my own store in Moscow, and that lasted quick. And then my wife and I and our two boys moved to Coeur d'Alene.
Tell me a little bit more about your father's medical practice.
Well, there isn't too much to tell about him. He was, as I say, one of the early day doctors. They had their own method of putting some medicines together, and he had an account with the Spokane Drug Company in Spokane. And when we were up at Melrose, I can remember the drugs were delivered by the stage line. Never had too much to come, or be just in small boxes. I do remember, though, that he had a very small showcase, and that was always moved wherever we went. And in that showcase would be different things that people would like. But I know the top shelf always had chocolate candy on it, and he'd always have some chocolate candy himself. And I have an idea that the young children got free samples. The one thing about it, my father always had a team of horses, and it wouldn't make any difference what time of day, night, or how much anyone owed him. If they called him to come, if someone was sick, he would bundle up, regardless of the weather, and take off. And I can remember seeing him several times. He was dressed in real heavy clothing. He had a very special fur cap that he pulled down over his head, and you could just barely see his eyes. But that was one thing about it. My dad went when he was called. Now, when we moved to Potlatch in 1907, I went to Potlatch in 1907. My folks went in 1906. I stayed with my stepmother's folks in Moscow. And the Potlatch Lumber Company was started in September 22nd in 1905. They burnt down a small shack. It was a log cabin, squatter shack they were called. And I believe that is where the power plant for the Potlatch mill is sitting today, on the spot where the log cabin is located. In 1906, they started the mill and started in operation. And the first manager was a fellow by the name of William Deary. And he was appointed by the Weyerhaeuser Company. And the mill at the time it was built in Ladle County, about 9 miles from Spruce, Washington, on the Potlatch River. The Weyerhaeuser Company had heard about the big pine stand of timber that was in Ladle County, and they bought all that they could get a hold of. And they came to Ladle County, and there was a real nice meadow where they built the mill. Potlatch is a name, is from the Indian name, and it means a great feast or general distribution of good things. Therefore, they thought that the Potlatch would be the logical name for the new mill. Now, the Washington, Idaho, and Montana Railroad, which might be called the Stump Dodger, or the Washington, Ironing, and Mending Railroad, was built between Spruce, Washington, and Beauville, Idaho. And although it's a separate organization from the Potlatch Company, it played a very important part in the development of the mill, because it gave the outlet at both Spruce to the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and the Inland Electric train that was running at that time. And then there was a line built in from St. Mary's to Elk River that made connections at Beauville, and it gave a very good outlet for all of the lumber. The first two locomotives that run the passenger trains were number 1 and 2, and they had 3 coaches, as I remember, when they first started, that ran to Spruce, and then from Spruce to Beauville, and then back to Spruce, and then back to Potlatch. That was a day's work. And they sometimes had what they called a mixed train. They didn't have enough to run a freight train. The engines number 1 and 2 would, if it was downgrade, they were capable of moving a pretty good sized mixed train, which would be boxcars loaded with lumber, or it might be flat cars loaded with lumber. But most of the time, the good lumber was shipped in boxcars. Now, the big deal to get the logs to the mill from Beauville was to bring the logs down about a 40-mile trip with engines number 21 and 22. And they were very large steam locomotives, quite a bit larger than the ones that carried the passengers. These engines have all been discarded. I really can't tell you where they are, except for number 1. It has been moved around behind the depot in Potlatch and sits on a separate track, and you can see it anytime that you go to Potlatch. It's kind of a curiosity to see the old steam engine. Now, getting back to the town of Potlatch, that was a home town. You might call it a one-man town. All of the real estate, houses, stores, hotels, and school buildings, and churches were owned by the Potlatch Lumber Company. There was about 300 houses of different designs, and they were rented to the people that were working in the mill at a very nominal rate of rent, and it was quite a thriving town. I believe about 1907 till 1930, it would be in the neighborhood of between 1,500 and 2,000 population. But I believe today 800 to 1,000 would cover it. I mentioned the churches. There was a Union church which had quite a large following. And I remember the first pastor was a Reverend Skates. And it wasn't too large a church, It's set across the street from grade school, and it was used just a very few years when they built a very fine church. It was called the Union Church. The Catholic Church was built and was used all through the years, and I believe it's still in use. And the Lutheran Church was just a small building. It never had very much of a following. But Reverend Anderson that came to Potlatch as the pastor of the Lutheran Church, was the pastor of the Union Church, pardon me. And in the last few years, I believe the pastor of the Lutheran Church is holding services both at his Lutheran Church and also in the Union Church. I don't know too much about the Catholic Church. I remember Father P. Cole was one of the first Catholic priests in Potlatch. Now, the sawmill itself, at the time it was built, was considered one of the largest in the United States. But that didn't hold good for a short time, because I understand they built another church in the state of Georgia that was larger, but not very much. The first engine in the Potlatch mill, it was all operated with belts and pulleys, and the first engine was 1,200 horsepower, and the 12 boilers provided the steam for that. The first floor of the sawmill was all belts and pulleys. The second floor was where they cut all the lumber. And the third floor is where they brought the bandsaws up to sharpen them. And there was also a catwalk for visitors to go through and stand up there and watch the operation of the mill. And there was always someone up there. They liked to have you come through and see what was going on. The planing mill was a separate machine and bandsaws from the regular mill, and it was run with the same kind of an engine, Twin City cordless engine, but it was only 700 horsepower, quite a bit smaller. In the last few years, these engines were all gone, been dismantled, and everything is run with electric motors. And to go through it now and see the difference. In the early days, it was all belts and pulleys, and there'd be miles of them. Today, that is all eliminated.
What's the difference in the amount of manpower used in the mill?
Well, electric motors have cut down on the manpower an awful lot. Just the mill alone, when I worked in it in 1921, I think it was something like 40 men that took care of the lumber in just the main floor of the sawmill. Today, I believe that is cut down but to 12. Everything is a push-button deal. And you see the fellow sitting up there pushing buttons where the men used to do the work. He's sitting up high enough that he can see everything that's going on. Now, you've mentioned the fact that my father was an early doctor in Idaho. The Potlatch Lumber Company had their own doctors, and they were called the company doctors. One of them was a Dr. E.T. Hine that had a small hospital in Peace, Washington. And he came up to Potlatch at least twice a week, and he had a small office in the building. But the resident doctor was a Dr. Thompson, a very good doctor. He was in Potlatch for many years. And then when Dr. Hine quit, There was a doctor by the name of Gittel that came from St. Mary's, Idaho. And he's a very good surgeon. He was at St. Mary's when the Milwaukee Railroad built through, and then he later moved to Beauville. But about 1918, he moved to Potlatch, Idaho. And the first building that they built in Potlatch, they provided two of them for the single men, and they were called the boarding house, 1 and 2. And in about 1918, they closed up number 1 boarding house and converted it into a hospital. And Dr. Gibson was the first doctor to take over in the new hospital in Potlatch. And he was there until 1946, when he retired and moved to the coast. And Dr. Thompson retired, moved to Moscow, and for a while, they didn't have a doctor there. But at the present time, there is a Dr. Biggerstaff in Potlatch, and he has been there for about 11 years. Now, in 1934, we moved to Coeur d'Alene. I haven't said where my wife and I met, but we met when I was working in the store in Potlatch, Idaho. Lee Olson, a Coeur d'Alene girl, she came down there as a stenographer, and I met her, and then the only way she could get rid of me was to marry me. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. This tape will be placed in the North Iowa College Library. Thank you for listening.
Okay.